Rick Harney, thank you so much for coming on and doing this today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
You were saying that have you done a podcast before?
No, I have not.
All right.
You're my first.
I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to you. I met you just a few years ago now. I don't know. I think I was probably maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe more than that. I can't remember the exact time frame, but I remember seeing you at an international carving competition and seeing these like low reliefs carvings that you had done, and just being mind blown that you could achieve. I think the craziest part was seeing all of the detail and depth and not realizing that it was shallow until I went to the side of it and realizing it's just, I mean, how thin are some of your pieces?
Well, when I first began carving, they were done in 3/4 inch pine. I didn't really know how to carve. I hadn't taken any lessons or been around any carvers before. And I just grabbed an old shelf and picked an image and just drew right on the board and cut it out with a jigsaw and started carving on one side of it. I had been really impressed by a sculptor when I was taking art history classes. There's an American sculptor named Augustus St. Gaudens. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but
yeah, sounds familiar.
He was probably America's greatest sculptor back in the 19th century, and lived in France. And he started out as a cameo cutter, so he was doing low relief portraits. And he did a series of low relief portraits that were cast in bronze. And his challenge was to get the work as thin as possible. And they all had backgrounds on them. And one night I was at a friend's house. He was an art teacher. And there were 3 of us just sitting around playing guitar, and it was the holidays. And he had this little cutout reindeer. And it was carved just a little bit around the edges. And it occurred to me that you could push that a little farther and not have a background on it and have it be freestanding. And it really might give you a little more implication of depth. So that's kind of how all that started. It was a combination of the art history and then just a chance meeting with a friend, having a very crude, crafty kind of reindeer during the holidays that was freestanding. And so I just decided to kind of get a few chisels. I only had 4 or 5 chisels when I started, and had an X-Acto knife and a box cutter. I'd never even seen an actual carving knife. And that's all I used for about the first 5 years. I had maybe 6 chisels. And because the work is in such low relief, it doesn't require, a whole set of chisels. And so anyway, that's kind of how that got started. And I didn't start sculpting with wood probably for maybe 10 years. I've been working in clay, making molds and casting them in fiberglass resin and Bondo. And I used to work for a company in Peoria, Illinois, that did interior church restoration. And I made large life-size sculptures, some of which had to be suspended, so they had to be lightweight. And I modeled them in clay and cast them in a combination of resin with a cloth. And a lot of times I use Bondo, which has the same resin in it, and it also has like pecan shell dust or marble dust mixed in with it to give it a heavier consistency. And after working with that stuff for about 10 years, I developed some health problems. and I was in the hospital for about a week, and they weren't 100% sure what was wrong with me. And then they started asking me what I did for a living, and I told them, and they just suggested I get a new hobby.
Wow.
So that's kind of how I got started wood carving. It was just sort of, kind of falling into it by default. And I was fortunate enough to get some work accepted into a gallery up in the Chicago area. And Fred Cogelo had seen some of the work in a gallery there and contacted me and invited me to go to the Woodcarvers Congress in Iowa, which is where you and I ultimately met.
Wow.
And it was a whole new culture that I didn't even know existed. I had a background in fine arts and finished my degree in art. And my goal was just get into a nice gallery and sell some pieces there. And once I got into the carving community, I learned so much from my students, many of whom are retirees and have been carving for 40 or 50 years. And I showed up with my 10 chisels and my box cutter to teach a class over at Larry Udis's place in Davenport. And I think they were immediately just kind of rolling their eyes, wondering who this guy was. And I couldn't blame him, because I had guys in there that were much better carvers than I was or am today. And a lot of these guys that I had for students over the years could just eat me for breakfast, from a sheer carving standpoint. They know more about the craft, and they taught me about quality woods to use, how to sharpen, which, as we all know, is very critical. And I learned so much from these guys about the craft of carving that I didn't know prior to that, and was utterly grateful. I think I probably got more out of the class than they did a lot of times. So that's kind of my little wood carving story.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what was it that, firstly, you kind of explained how you got into teaching. It was through Congress.
Yes.
And then from there, what was it that you appreciated about carving? Maybe that kind of it was different than clay, because they're pretty, they're both sculpture, but they involve completely different kind of modes of thought in some way, maybe in some ways, right? Or what do you think?
Well, they're similar with regard to the fact that you're observing a form, right, and then you record it, either in clay or in wood. But one is additive, clay, and clay is also quite forgiving. If you're having a bad day, you can go back and fix your mistakes. Right. And with wood, I always kind of like the idea that you're sort of walking a tightrope with it. There's a little risk involved. And anybody that carves will tell you they have pieces that end up in the fireplace because they just zigged when they should have zagged. And I really loved making sculpture out of the product that I picked up, like a stick of wood that I knew ultimately would be the final thing. When you work with clay and then cast things, either in bronze, resin, plaster, there are intermediate steps that have to be taken along the way. Mold making is a whole different set of skills that are critical. If you're going to be any good at casting things, you have to be a good mold maker. And then you have to choose a material that you cast that, for me, I use Bondo. Anybody that's worked with that knows how handy that stuff is. You can plug a hole with it. And for me, it was handy because it was cheap. And I could add liquid resin to it and make it a little more viscous so I could pour it into a mold. And there's always cleanup after you pull off the molds, and assembly with a cast project, whether it's in bronze or whatever. The bronzes that I've done, some of them have been maybe in 18 or 19 pieces. And they all have, the foundry had to weld them back together and secure all the joints and everything.
Wow.
When you're carving, and for me, it's always been very simple because I just work with relief work. And it's flat on the back. I'm only attacking it from one side. And so it's a pretty simple process. And for me, I've always loved drawing, and the kind of relief work I do, as you mentioned, they look three-dimensional. That was kind of my whole idea when I got started, was to kind of trick the viewer a little bit. And that's what drawing is. That's what painting is. You know, those are two things that you do on a flat medium. And you draw the viewer's eye to a place to imply depth. And when I carve, I get to do a little sculpting. I do a little drawing. You know, there's perspective involved. And I introduce painting to the carving a little later on over time. I have a couple of carvings that I did here. They were among the first that I did, and they had very little paint added to them. And they were done on a 3/4 inch pine. I took them up to the gallery in Chicago, and they weren't properly lit. And any sculptor will tell you that light sculpts your work. And they just were so flat, they just kind of got absorbed into the wall up there. And I just thought, you know, I can't take it. You know, they weren't meant to be seen that way, but, you know, they didn't know. I had suggested to them that they dramatically light them, but, you know, I think for spatial reasons, they just didn't get around to it. And so I began to paint them a little more heavily.
Oh.
And I have a couple of those pieces here. Do you want me to grab them real quick?
I would love that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just like, be right back.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Here's some show and tell. This was done in 1986, and you can see how thin this is.
Wow.
This was just an old shelf that I got, and just started drawing and carving on it. And I thought, well, let's just see what happens. And you can see here how thin that face is. And in my studio here, at least I've got some strong side light, so it kind of sculpts the form. But when you turn this in profile, I don't know if you can see how thin that is. There's just not that much there. So if the light is flat, the piece doesn't necessarily do very much. And I kind of got a little more courageous at a certain point, and got away from being such a purist. When I first started carving, most of the work that I was looking at was unpainted. So I just got my paints out one day, and as time went on, began to use the paint to enhance the form and amplify the dimensional qualities of it a little bit more. This piece that I have right here, for example.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
This is kind of everybody's favorite project that I did when I was teaching. And it's a little thicker piece. You can see in profile here.
Unbelievably thin, though.
Well, that other piece was 3/4 of an inch thick. This is more like 1.5 inches. So there's considerably more material to work with.
Sure.
But
still,
the addition of paint enhances the form, and if you're able to control the values a little more, the light and the dark, just as you would in a drawing, that helps you develop a little more volume in the piece.
Can you lift it up just a little higher?
Yes.
Just a tiny bit higher. Yeah, there you go. Wow. That is remarkably good. I mean, so painting, is this the skin itself is also painted there? Looks like
It is, yes. And it took some time to achieve something that my goal was to not overpaint the work.
right.
I have seen a number of really nice carvings that suffered with bad paint jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I did was I always sealed the work up first prior to painting it with multiple coats of, I currently use a clear shellac and a water-based varnish. And then I apply the paint over that. So I have a sealed surface, which allows me to add a little bit of color. And if I don't like it, I just remove it while it's still in a wet state. So you can slowly build it up that way.
Okay. Are there more than one coat on with the initial clear coat there? The shellac?
Yes. There's usually a couple of coats on there. I want to be assured that the wood fiber is sealed up adequately.
Yeah.
And it allows me to more or less erase whatever color I've applied. So I have a lot more control that way. And for anybody who's done watercolor, for example, that's a building up kind of process. And I would tell my students I don't get in a rush to paint them. Often, you've got a project that's carved and maybe you've dedicated 2 months to it. And I don't know why everybody feels like you need to paint it in an hour.
True.
Typically what I'll do is I'll start and kind of get some foundation colors on there. Just give myself an idea of what colors I'm going to use. For example, with this, I decided on some things here that I thought might be suitable for the project. He's got actually, I don't know if you can see that, there's a little floral thing going on up there in his hat, and I'm not sure what lamp that would be. But I wanted to introduce some red and mauve to the piece. I thought that might be kind of refreshing to the eye to have something like that up there. Yeah. And usually I'll get a little color on there, and then I'll spend an hour or two painting on it, and then let it sit and think about it. Let it marinate for a day or two. Go back and put a little more on. And a paint job might take, for larger work, maybe 8 to 10 hours. And I'll do it in periods of 2 to 3 hours and then just quit because I don't want them overdone.
Right. Did you ever apply oils to them, or have you always been using water-based paints?
Everything I did was in oils for many years. I've been at this, I guess, since mid-'80s. And I had so much more control with the oils. You can thin them better, blend them better right on the piece. And I just think the color is a little more vibrant too. Same goes for if you're painting portraits on canvas. But I had to move out of my studio about 5 years ago after I injured my hand. And so I work in the room that I'm in right now. It's just a little basement room. And I don't have any ventilation down here. And so I've been using acrylics and also water mixable oil. I don't know if you've ever used those or not.
No.
Oh my gosh. The blending with those is vastly better than with acrylic.
Really?
Yeah. Actually, I brought a piece down. I thought you might ask about that. This is a piece that, just because of the nature of it, because it's a young girl.
Wow.
I started this with acrylic to kind of build the color up. And then I did the final blending with water mixable oils. I wanted her skin to have a very smooth kind of velvety quality to it. And so I put the water mixable oils actually over the acrylic. Wow. And it achieves kind of a nice blend.
Beautiful.
They're very slow drying. That's the downside to the water mixable oils. But it's oil paint, and I guess there's some kind of emulsifier in there that allows you to thin and clean up with water. And
Wow.
I've used it of them. Yeah, I started doing some oil painting. And
can you show the thickness?
A few years ago.
Okay. So you were carving and then moved to oil painting, because I've seen some of your paintings and they're stunning. Was that came after carving then and sculpture?
Yes. Okay. I started taking painting a little more seriously maybe 5 years ago after I injured my hand. And I think I may have mentioned I fell off a ladder, and my right hand has never quite been the same. And that's why I had to give up carving for so long. And so I took up painting, and I was actually quite inspired by Rose Franson. Yeah. And really always wanted to be able to paint like that. And I had been doing head studies in clay and in wood, because portraiture was kind of my main interest when I was doing carving. And so painting portraits was just kind of a natural transition. Yeah. And I just started copying the masters. And I consider Rose to be right up there. And absolutely, I tried to copy her work, and it took me a little while to kind of develop my own style to a certain extent. And like everything else, you have to work at it. It didn't come naturally to me. And I had so little control with my hand at the time after I'd been injured that I thought I was going to have to develop a little looser style because my aim was off. But over time, I developed something where I felt like I had pretty decent results. I'll grab one here real quick if you got a minute.
Thanks. Yeah. I love it. Wow.
This is something I did maybe, 3 months ago, give or take.
That's awesome.
And for those who kind of wondered how I managed to get flesh tones out of my carvings, I don't know how good the camera is here that allows you to see the different colors that I've used here. But if you look within the skin tone, there are blues and grays, as well as tans and things that you associate with skin tone. And this was done from a black and white photograph. Wow. And I had sculpted Einstein on a number of occasions, but never attempted to paint him. And you can kind of see, like these shadows in here, for example. Those are kind of teal, blue, gray, some grays that are in here and stuff like that. So my goal when I was painting my carvings was to use this multicolored layering process, because our skin doesn't have just one tone in it. And anyway, ultimately what you try and do is get the whole thing to read as believable flesh. Right. And I'm working on it, not there yet.
It's beautiful.
They are improving, I think, with time and work, a lot of work.
It's incredible to see the color, the amount of colors that go into that specific painting. Like you said, I could see yellows and of course the typical brownish cream tones, but then like you're saying, there's like blue and greenish blue and all this. There's so many colors that show up, and when you see it, it just registers as skin. But until you started pointing out all of the different shades, it's something you don't really see that unless you've kind of taught yourself to see that, maybe.
That might be part of it too. And looking at artwork for me, it's always been such a joy. I mean, I just can't get enough of it. And I was always impressed by a couple of impressionist portrait artists. John Singer Sargent, who is just a real whiz with a paintbrush. But his use of color He was kind of a later impressionist painter, and I don't know how much you know about that, but they were using colors that you wouldn't necessarily look for in a lot of other portrait artist work. Even Rembrandt, though, I mean, he did a bit of that. There would be some subtle blues and things like that that you'd see in his work. It wasn't quite as obvious as it was in painters who worked maybe later in the 19th century, but those were my inspiration. And when I was doing the carvings, I did what I could to do the best carving I could first. You can't fix a really bad carving with a good paint job. Conversely, I think you could ruin a perfectly good carving with a bad paint job. But my goal was
experience in that.
Yeah, I just wanted to marry sculpture and painting together, and come up with these images that, from a distance, looked like a real person was standing there. They have kind of a 3D illusion to them. And I didn't have to be a great carver. I don't consider myself to be a very good carver, really, but I can make the carving good enough that I can provide a good foundation for the color. And my all-time favorite artist is Van Gogh. And one of the things that I admired most about his work was his brushwork. And my goal was to translate that into wood. And if you look at Van Gogh's work, there are brush marks that are highly distinctive, as there are with chisel marks, different size gouges, the direction of those. So I would use different size gouges, try to create a certain rhythm in a piece, and then all of those little places where your gouge has gone in, it gives you a little pool where your color can settle. And so I was pretty cognitive about how I was making marks as I was going along and imagining where color might ultimately play into the picture there. So
that's so satisfying to hear, because the first thing I thought of when I saw that piece you said that you've taught from quite a bit, that man with the hat and the flower. So my first thought on seeing that was Van Gogh. And the more I look at it, the more I talk myself out of bringing that up, because it doesn't look like a Van Gogh in that it's stylistically more, it's more on the realism side, but, or naturalism, I guess to use the right terms, but it's got this, I don't know if the term is impressionistic element to it, where there's more than just naturalism there. I don't know how you achieve that, but yeah, the cuts, that makes a lot of sense now as you describe it, that you can see in the shirt the movement of the cuts, and that they create the folds of the fabric, like my shirt. Well,
one of the things that I tried to impress upon my students too, and I tried to compare it to drawing. Anybody that draws pictures goes for halftones and then areas that are very dark. And I tried to let them know that when they were carving, they could kind of do the same thing with their tools. There are shallow gouges that more or less represent the areas where you're doing subtle shading. And I tried to discourage them from picking up a knife too soon. Because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, you can be digging in the wrong place with a knife and you're done. But the other thing is, my goal was to attract the viewer's eye to certain features of the piece, which a definitive cut like a knife draws your eye immediately. And if you kind of look at this piece, you can see around the eyes and the nose, nostrils, and the lips, and here around the neck, around the collar. Those are the only places where I use a knife. Everything else is done with shallow gouges. I used a vein or two here and there. But one of the reasons that those things immediately draw your eye is because I saved the knife cut for last. So that's, does that make sense?
That's an incredibly helpful thing. Yeah, method there, because as you said, even with V tools, people get too happy with them. Yes. And then they start creating deep lines. Even with hair, especially you see this with like hair detail, that the tendency for a student is to do a lot of tightly knit grooves that sort of are harsh and either done with a V tool or maybe a knife, but mostly you see these kind of haystack looking, I've heard it called haystack beards, where it's just parallel lines going in sequence, perfectly symmetrical to one another, and equidistant. And it's like, it doesn't look good, right? The hair is like, in what I'm seeing on your beard is there are some veiner details, but it's soft. You're still maintaining, the shape is the most important thing, not the tiny details of each hair, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's huge. So that's something I've recently started teaching, and I don't know, I've probably heard it from someone a lot wiser like yourself, that try to work with a veiner as opposed to a V tool if you're going to make a harsh line starting out, to test out if you like it, because the V tool will be a more permanent, deeper cut, generally speaking, than a similarly sized number 9 or a 10 or an 11. A deeper gouge, more curved gouge, or a deeper, like a veiner. So it's good to hear you say that. It's a very practical. I mean, I know we're in the weeds for those who are not carvers, but you're listening to the wrong podcast if you're. Although, no, I've heard of it. It's funny. There are a few people who have said that they like to join their wood carving friends in watching, just to hear the interviews, that blows my mind, because if I wasn't carving, I don't know what I'd get out of a lot of these, but that's great. Anyway.
Well, I think maybe you too pick up tricks from your students. I learned an immense amount from the people I taught.
Yeah.
And this probably pretty common thing you hear among carvers, but it's a friendly culture, and people are willing to share what they know.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like guitar players, there's a certain fellowship with people. Yeah. And I have found that carvers to be just utterly generous with their information and sharing it. And it's so different. When I was in art school, I got criticized for being too emotional with my work. And I was in college back in the 70s when I got started. And that was a time when sculpture especially was abstract. There were welded car bumpers, and nobody was doing figurative work. And I had gone back to school after I worked for this church restoration company. And I still wanted to do figurative work. And they were not supportive.
Wow.
In any way of what I was doing. And so once, I started doing wood carving and was introduced to the wood carving culture. They seemed to embrace what I was doing, even if my approach was kind of weird. And I wasn't much of a carver. They seemed to have some interest in what it was, and they were very supportive, utterly supportive. As I said, I've never really thought of myself as much of a carver, but it didn't matter to these people. They wanted to give it a try, and I felt flattered and grateful for that. The fine art community is just, you gotta be cool, or brooding genius. I don't know.
Yeah.
It just, it took me a long time to finish my degree because I just I didn't get a lot of support when I was in school for what I wanted to do. But I think I always knew they were kind of wrong, and that once you get out of school, you have to live however you want to live and do the things you need to do. So here I am talking to you, Alec.
Do you think that fueled you? Do you think that the fact that a lot of folks in that institution didn't like or accept the style of artwork that you loved, do you think that maybe kind of gave you in some way a bit of a feeling of maybe that was part of the fuel there?
Our furnace just came on. I can't hear you.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, you're going to have to edit that part.
Yeah, no worries. No.
I'll lean real close.
No. There you go. I just said, do you think that fueled you, their kind of lack of belief in the style of art that you were doing? Do you think that was motivating to you?
Yes. I have a quote, in fact, here in my little room that says, "The greatest art is made out of contempt for ingratiation."
What does ingratiation mean?
Ungrateful. Lack of appreciation.
Right.
And I admired Michelangelo and Rodin, and there was a strong movement in sculpture to get away from the figure. You know, it was good enough for thousands of years, and then all at once, these people in the academic world poo-pooed it, and I had a hard time accepting that, and had already earned money as an artist doing figurative work prior to going back to getting my degree. I am grateful, though, for what I learned in art history.
Yeah.
That really is what brought me to the stage where I was with my work. And when I couldn't carve, I mean, there were periods when I would get tendonitis or, whatever. There were other materials that I could still make sculpture with. And I loved working in ceramic and had people firework for me. And then I would just paint it. I didn't know how to glaze or anything. And so I just used my painting skills to finish them up. And I had done a series of life-size bronzes and began to work with cardboard. I don't know if any of your viewers have ever done a life-size work with clay, but it's not solid clay. There's a form beneath it that makes up about 90% of the shape. And then you got maybe an inch of clay on the outside. And
what is that typically for you made of, the underlayer, or that structure?
Yeah.
What is it made of?
Sometimes, what is the under sculpture made? Okay, I use cardboard.
Really?
Yeah. I started out using styrofoam, and I kind of hate that because it's static electricity, and it would just make a mess. It's just insidious as everywhere. And it was kind of pricey. And I figured out a way to just get old cardboard boxes and cut them up and shape them so that they were strong, because cardboard, when it's laminated, and you've got maybe 3 layers thick, is really strong. And then we'll just cover it with oil-based clay to make life-size figures.
What are you cutting the cardboard with? Is it knives or?
Box cutter. I have a pair of shears that I use.
Yeah.
And usually when you take a piece like that to the foundry, it'll be in one piece. And when they make molds, they cut it up. Like they'll remove the arm, a leg, do the torso separately, the head is separate, and they'll just take a Sawzall to it.
Wow.
And they'll just cut right through it, which you can do if it's cardboard. And the other thing, too, is it's so lightweight. For your viewers that haven't met me, I'm a little guy. I mean, I weigh maybe 135 or 40 pounds, and there was no way I was going to take a sculpture that was 6 feet tall and haul that around if it weighed a couple hundred pounds. But ultimately I could usually move these things around on my own. And so it was a combination of the budget, because it was so cheap, and it just worked. And the
That's
foundries kind of liked them too. It was easy to work with for them, easy to cut.
I'm so sorry. You said they cut them in half. Is that part of the mold making process then?
Well, anything that is in the round is going to be split in half. They actually, what they would do, let's say they would remove the head, for example, and then the head would be molded, usually a front half and a back half. And they create a wall so that they can split those two things apart. So the mold is in two pieces. Any sphere, round type shape is going to be done that way.
Right.
They have to do it that way. And anyway, I brought along a little show and tell. This is the very early stages of a forearm and hand.
Wow.
And this thing just weighs a few ounces. But that's what it is.
Look at
it's
that.
Just done with wood glue. I use carpenter's glue because it's fast setting and strong. And to anchor this stuff down, I'll just put in some drywall screws. And after a couple of minutes, the glue is dry enough that I can just back the screws out.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's what these holes are. When I first saw that, I thought nails, but those are holes. Okay.
Yeah, they're just, so now it's just a hole. Like you drilled a hole in it almost. And I usually would make things like this. And I'll grab another piece here real quick.
Yeah.
I don't want to get off the carving thing too much.
No, that's great.
Okay.
This is great.
Wow. These are pieces that began with the same process, where it was cardboard first. And they were all three done over a wooden frame. It actually came from an old aluminum coat rack. And I call this piece a goat rack. And after the cardboard was done, I was able to go at it and do a little more detail using paper mache. And I use kind of a hybrid product. If you look at this area down here, you can see it's kind of a grayish, kind of a multicolored thing. That's actually old newspaper insulation.
You're kidding.
And I mix it with a vinyl adhesive. It's pre-mixed. I used to mix my own. But this stuff is so strong when you get done with it. It's probably at least as hard as pine.
Wow.
And this final look, the aesthetic on here, this was done with just a hobby craft white paper mache. And these are, you can see these are maybe a quarter of an inch thick. And that's just the paper mache over cardboard. And it is really stout. And this ear here, for example, the front ear, that coloration is done with a combination of old sandwich bags, just paper sandwich bags that I had sitting around.
Wow.
And this is done, this is old sycamore bark that I picked up.
No way.
Wetted it and flattened it out and then glued it on over the paper mache. And then your carvers would be familiar with the next step. The last step is I use a wood burner. So there's no paint on that piece.
Wow.
Yeah, it's all
it's like a found materials type situation almost.
Yeah, it's just pick up and use whatever you got.
That is so cool. Where did you learn all of these? Because who would know to use all these kind of pieces and bits and adhesives and all this stuff? Where did you come up with this stuff?
Well, I think I've been making sculpture for almost 50 years, 48 years, I guess. I would have started when I was about 20.
Wow.
After a while, you just pick up whatever works. And so I'd experienced a lot of different situations where I had to find whatever material was best for that job. And the cardboard I've been using for quite some time because it came in handy when I was doing life-size sculpture. And I started looking at artists that were using it as a final medium. They weren't putting anything over it. They were actually modeling cardboard, which I'm not there yet. I may have sent you an image of this fawn or something. I don't know if you had that or not.
Yeah, I can pull that up on the
yeah, I think I maybe sent that one on your phone or something.
Yeah, here. Let's pull it up.
It kind of depends on the scale that you're working to, because I have difficulty getting the cardboard to behave that well on a small
fawn
scale.
Table, right?
And the paper mache material I mix up into a pulp, kind of like the consistency of hamburger. That one right there actually is mostly cardboard.
Wow.
And then there's paper mache on top of that. And also, and there's no paint on that one either. It's tree bark on there.
Wow.
Different colors of tree bark on there. And actually the top, it's sort of a hall table, but the top was just an old shelf that I got in the discount pile at Hobby Lobby or someplace like that. And it's sort of a half moon shape, so the piece is flat on the back. And so that was the found piece that I started with, and the rest of it I just kind of winged it with whatever materials I had in the studio.
So you're not kidding about this stuff being structural.
It's pretty strong. I think people will be shocked. There are a couple of guys out there that are my cardboard heroes. They have work online that they inspired me to do more. A guy named Scott Fife and another gentleman named James Lake. And they don't use any of the materials. They just use the cardboard as a finished piece. Yeah.
Oh yeah. How cool. Really? So they're not even, so that's wild. That's a crazy, here's Scott Fife. This is this his version of Elvis?
Yes. That's just cardboard. That's all crazy. That is. Isn't that beautiful? Cool.
Really neat.
Yeah, his modeling skills are just superb. I'm really impressed. I have not gotten to that point yet, but I've been using a lot of it here in the last few years.
How fun. Yeah, it's funny. There's a lot of carvers who enjoy, and where it's necessary for those who are doing large-scale pieces where there's a commissioner who wants to see a model beforehand, before they drop 10 G's or 20 G, whatever it is, however much money you're charging, or sometimes a lot more. And so they'll do the clay mock-up, and then they find that they'll go to the carving, and they enjoy the process of the clay more than the carving. At least I can think of one person who has done this hundreds and hundreds of times in his career and has always said, I wish I could just do clay. And I've always had this thought of, him, this is a limiting thought process, because he could so easily, use some of the, not necessarily so easily, but he could take these clay mold, sculptures that are like fully rendered that he's doing before each wood carved piece. And like you're saying, take them to a foundry and have them cast and create a limited edition run of bronzes. He doesn't even have to do bronzes. He could cast them pretty simply himself using silicone, and then create, if you could pour resin, or you could pour, if you want a safer, you could do a hydrocal, and he could, create a process. But people are just, some people, I think everyone limits themselves in some way. And he just kind of limited himself in that he thought no one would be interested in anything but carving. And I love that you're exploring other things.
Well, I think that's a good point. And I think because I came from a background where it wasn't just about carving, I might have been a little more receptive to that. And I'd encourage students to work in clay first, especially if they were anxious about a piece that was a little more intricate. And when I first started carving, I made clay models for my work. They were crude, very crude, but it helped me kind of determine how thick to make the piece. Because if you're doing something fairly small, you can use a pretty thin piece of wood.
Yeah.
As you expand, you've got to make the piece a little thicker. And I brought this one along for illustration. This is probably 2.5 inches thick.
Oh, wow.
But look at the size of the face.
Wow. Yeah, that's massive.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So a clay model is a really good way to introduce yourself to the form. And it reduces a lot of the anxiety. And I know a lot of people are averse to doing that because they're making the form twice.
Right.
But it allows you to work out problems in a changeable material first. And you don't have to make a finished piece. But if you decide you want to do that, you know, if it's water-based clay, you can just fire it.
Right.
Or if you want to move the clay process to completion, you can always make a mold. So it gives you options for other
options,
things.
Options, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a whole other thing to learn, though, and I think people are intimidated by that. And you see this, at least in my experience, and I'm curious yours, because a lot of times I'll have students who will be looking for a process because they're used to maybe a mindset of this is what I need to do to get to the end point, right? Because they started with the same books I did, which were, okay, first we're going to do this, then this, then this, then this. And which I fully believe that if you're starting out in carving, those are great starting points. But then, you know, there's a point where you need to be able to see things and just trust your brain to try to transcribe them. You know, there's an artistic element to it where you see something and you just do your best, and people bypass that seeing thing and they just want to know what the next step is. Have you noticed that, at least, that maybe this is coming from a place of having a lot of experience where these people feel inexperienced and they don't trust their instincts to be able to apply what they're seeing? And it sounds like, oh, that sounds easy for you guys because you've been, you know, sculpting for a long time. But even when you start out, the big revelations, for me at least, were just looked like that experience of going like, well, I'm not capable of this, but there's no way I can do this, but I got to start somewhere. So I'll carve this face of this particular dude. Before you know it, you know, just from studying it diligently, a painter friend of mine taught me that you should try to spend as much or more time looking at your reference as your art piece.
Oh, I agree.
And so have you run into that with people where the hold up is they don't trust themselves? They almost want to rely on you too much?
Absolutely. And I would generally just teach a 3-day workshop. And one of the things that I learned early on was to provide my students with replicas of the finished project.
What a great
that
idea.
guy with the hat on, the hobo that I showed you, that's a painted replica. That's not the original.
Oh,
and I would provide my students, each student had their own, and they were unpainted. So they're able to analyze the form.
That's great.
And have it right in front of them as they did it. I mean, if they wanted to use calipers and take measurements or whatever they wanted to do, they could do it in their own fashion that way. For me, I think that's probably why I was trying to get them to work in clay first, so that they could create their own work. And if they had a photograph, let's say a portrait of somebody that they loved, and wanted to carve that, I encouraged them to work it out in clay first. And some of these guys just fell in love with it. You know, they kind of wondered why they'd never dabbled in it. And I think maybe thought it might have been a waste of time. But once you have that image as a reference, it makes the carving process so much easier. And as I mentioned, I did it early on when I was carving. I can work from a drawing now. I know where it's headed. I've done enough of it.
Right.
But I was anxious too when I got started. And carving is, you got one crack at it, you know? It's kind of like getting up the nerve to ask a girl out, you know?
Right.
It's going to make you or break you.
Yeah.
And yeah, there were a lot of students that were anxious, but, you know, I tried when I was teaching to not make it a competition. I just wanted them to have a good learning experience as much as anything. And try not to be so hard on themselves, because I've carved and sculpted in clay hundreds of faces over time. And many people, and I assume this is true for your students too, are retirees and hobbyists.
Yep.
And, you know, they had a life filled with other responsibilities. They just didn't have an opportunity to do it before. It doesn't mean they can't get good at it.
Yeah.
And maybe they feel like they need to get good at it right away. I don't know. Do you have your students work in clay at all? Is that something you include in your classes?
Never. We've never really worked with clay in a class before. And I talked with our local art Center for the Arts, and they talked about needing a portrait sculptor to teach clay. And I have been playing with clay for the last, I don't know, for a little over a year maybe, or less than a year, around there, and have just enjoyed it immensely. And I've worked with it before, oil-based clay, but water-based is this kind of new, this past year's thing, since my neighbor got a kiln, of course.
Yeah.
And we bought my mom a kiln for her birthday, which was also a birthday gift for me, but I guess. But no, just okay, I have ADHD because I just judged a carving competition, and the bird that I gave first place just showed up, the same species, and I'm forgetting the name of it, just showed up by my door. Anyway, ironically, when I went up to him, I said, "Oh, I loved your bird," and I didn't have a badge, or they didn't give me a badge. So he just says, "Oh, thank you. It actually just won first place in the show." And I said, "Wow, congratulations!" Then I left. So he didn't know that was my fault. But what I was going to say was, I've recently desired to play in clay more, and I think I'll try to I want to try and use it in my classes, or just even just teaching a clay class separately. But I've never thought about combining the two. That's really interesting. That's a great idea.
Now that you have some experience with clay that can be fired, one thing that you might share with them is that it isn't a waste of time, because once it's fired, it's permanent.
Right.
A lot of models that are done in oil-based clay, unless you have the means or skills to make a mold and cast it, those remain just a transitional material. Although the oil-based clay will last forever, but it's not some bronze or even cast aluminum or resin.
Right.
They both provide, I think, a lot of security, though. If you have a finished clay model or something, at least, it helps you with the proportions, so that when you begin to carve, you can do it a little more relaxed manner. And I imagine you've carved hundreds of faces too. But if a student has created that shape already in clay, he's familiarized himself with the features and the relative proportions.
Right.
And it's such a great tool to have. I think some people feel like they're wasting their time with it, though, if it's not permanent.
Right.
But, there are materials that you can use, like air-dried clay. It doesn't have to be fired. You can use sculpty clay.
Right.
Just stick in the oven,
Yeah. Right.
There are other ways to go about it. And even paper mache. There are all kinds of things that you can do with that.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, that's something I will definitely consider doing, because maybe that will help people get past this feeling that once they've done it, it's ruined, and this hesitancy that's accompanying that. One way I've tried and was fairly successful at combating this hesitancy was a warm-up carving. So at the beginning of a longer class, like a 5-day class, I've done this a couple of times where I'll just say, okay, today's objective is to make a small, quick carving that you can throw out at the end of class, just as a way of kind of moving through quickly the basic elements. And that will be a practice piece for our main project. And so I would emphasize, doesn't matter what this thing looks like. I don't care if you put it in this bin before you walk out of here. Just there's no pressure at all. And what people found is that they were mostly satisfied with their little one-day project. And I think maybe the levity of saying that this project doesn't matter as much. It's small, it's quick, it's rough. Maybe it tricked them into having a little bit maybe more fun than they would have otherwise.
Well, one of the things about art history that's really helpful for me, if you look at some of the great painters, for example, often those came about because of hundreds of sketches, preliminary work.
That's great.
They weren't committing to the canvas anything that hadn't kind of been resolved prior to picking up a brush. And if you can maybe relay it to them in that way, let them know that it's just kind of a preliminary step that can help them come up with a better finished piece. That's the beauty of clay, too. You can't goof it up.
Right.
You can fix anything. And having the oil-based stuff, and I found a material, it's called Sculptex, that doesn't have any sulfur in it, and it models just beautifully.
And it air dries?
It does not dry. It's an oil-based clay.
Okay.
The stuff lasts for years. I've got some stuff here at the house that it's probably 20 years old. And it doesn't really dry out. So, even if they're not casting their models, they can always just put them on a shelf somewhere, But having that reference is, I think, crucial to anybody that's anxious or, a novice that doesn't know what tool to pick up.
That's great. I'm going to grab my charger. Give me just a second, because my battery's about to die here.
How long have we going on here, Alex?
All right. Go. That's good advice. Yeah, that's good advice. Having that background in art is that's huge. Do you find that people in the carving community, maybe they could? There's this controversy about whether like carving is considered a fine art medium, like wood. is a fine art medium, and how it's not right. Like it's not like going to be in your, your fine art classes in college, and that makes a lot of woodcarvers upset. And even Caggiolo has gone so far as to say that his desire is to raise the art of wood carving to a higher level by virtue of creating better work, or whatever his terms are, like by making work that raises the sort of level of wood carving in the view of the art community. And so what do you think about that? Has that ever been kind of dipping your feet into both waters, or not dipping your feet, being fully immersed into both kind of streams? What do you think the relationship is there, and does it bother you or frustrate you that carving isn't quite accepted?
Clearly, Fred has achieved his goal.
Yeah.
His work is masterful.
Yeah.
It's original. There's nobody like him, really.
No.
Mm-mm. And I had to deal with, I'll just say it, a lot of snobs in the fine art world.
Yeah, right.
Who refuse to look at the craft and artistry in wood carving. And a lot of the images that you see, you've judged a number of shows and seen a lot of work, are similar. You've seen them before.
Yeah.
A lot of fine arts is based on what's new. And the craft part of it, to some extent, has gone out of fine arts. By the time I got out of school, there was installation sculpture that didn't amount to much of anything. There was no traditional craft there. I think people who are in the wood carving community have a respect for craft. And I don't see that a lot of people in the fine arts community have that. I think they figure if you're a wood carver, you're somebody sitting on a front porch in a rocker, the stick of straw hanging out of your mouth and missing some teeth, and
with your Mountain Dew.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people in the fine arts community that just did not respect what I was doing. But I did have a few who understood how difficult it was. For one thing, it was figurative, and anybody like yourself that has attempted to do a portrait, which I think is still the hardest thing there is to do, understands that it requires some skill. And to do it in wood, which I think is one of the most difficult materials, it's the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with. Because you're taking a chance every time you put your chisel to the wood. I think it's ignorance on their part to some extent about what is involved in creating a carving. Could be that had that been taught in school, they may have some better understanding of the commitment that an artist makes to doing a carving. And my wife had pointed out too, there are a lot of people that do two-dimensional work. They'll do sketches or paintings. Sometimes I'll finish them in a week. When you do a carving, and some of the ones that I've done have taken months. My wife pointed out, that you have a relationship to the piece that you don't have with something that you dash off in a half-hour study. And for people that don't make sculpture, and there's a small number of people that make sculpture, that are in the fine arts, it's just, that's the section of people that take it on. It's sweat, you're busting your knuckles. It may seem to some people not intellectual enough, which is garbage. But that's kind of how some of them have viewed it in the past. At least that's the bias that I had. I was lucky that I did have some individuals that I had as teachers, one in particular who was himself a figurative sculptor. And he was utterly supportive of what I was doing. and he knew that there was still a place for it. But I had a number of people when I was in college that said I was in the wrong place. And actually, I agreed with them. So I quit. I got a studio and I just kept making stuff. And,
Wow.
whatever works. I just, I don't know, maybe I'm one of those guys with a stick of hay coming out of my mouth. And that's okay.
I think not. Your work says otherwise, and so does your face,
Thank
but your teeth.
Well, I'm trying.
Yeah.
And I think whatever I can say to your other carvers out there, find something that you're comfortable with, that you feel in your heart when you start it, and as you do it, that it's the right thing to be doing. As you know, it takes a tremendous amount of time and love to finish a wood carving. And every person's going to have different results.
Right.
You don't want everybody doing the same thing. That's kind of boring.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the show in Iowa, the variety that you see there, and the skill level too, it's just remarkable. It's unfortunate that some people don't have the appreciation that we would have for it, but I think it's because we've done it. And I don't know how long I could go up and down the streets of my town before I would find another wood carver, but there ain't that many of us around. And it's unfortunate. It's kind of a dying craft.
Yeah.
I think I think younger people are more inclined, no offense to you, young fella, to find something that's more immediate gratification. And they're missing out on something I think really beautiful in life, and that's making things with your hands. And
It's true.
I would hate for that to go away. It's too important. It's a primal thing. I saw this. I don't know how related this is to our conversation, but there's a great documentary on beavers building dams. And I thought, that's me. These are just these creatures that can't stop themselves, and they hear water running and they have to just dam it up. And they'll go to any lengths to do it. There's one scene where this little beaver's pushing a boulder in place. And they work and they work. And making sculpture is a lot like that too. There was a famous guy, Frank Gallo, who said that sculpture was 1% talent and 99% sweat. And I think there's maybe some truth to that for wood carvers too.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for being willing to share all this time with us and to share your absolutely stunning work. I know my wife and I were looking at the email that you sent me with the works, and we were just going like, this is the work of an absolute just a mastery in your work is astounding, and your understanding of the shapes it's gone beyond just trying to capture the shapes anymore, and it goes into the expressiveness of those shapes and the story that you tell with them. And that's such a thing that, I hope to one day get to, is being able, you're not just struggling to try and get the likeness. Now you're beyond that. You're attempting to, by virtue of the way that you do that, say something else about the person and the piece, and kind of put yourself in it too. So that is one of my favorite things about your work, and I appreciate you sharing it. So
thanks for having me out. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope to do it again. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.